Is that a gift, or did the catering staff just leave their trash on the table?
The whole ballroom laughed. Every guest turned toward the woman in the black server's vest, the one holding a worn little recipe box she'd carried for 9 years. The billionaire's fiancé lifted it like something unclean. "Darling, you don't actually want to open something the help prepared in front of all these people?" Simone Aubrey didn't flinch. She'd waited too many years for this night to flinch now. Then the billionaire opened the box. He read one line and the color drained from his face, because inside was proof of a debt his family had buried for 30 years. A truth that would end an engagement silence the richest room in the country and change everything. If you believe quiet dignity should outweigh loud money, take a second to subscribe. Now let's begin. The Thorne estate sat on the crown of a hill and burned against the dark like a small private city. From the valley road, you could see it long before you reached it, every window lit, every terrace washed in gold, the whole house glowing as if it had swallowed a piece of the sun and refused to give it back. Cars filled the drive in a slow, glittering river. Not one of them was ordinary. Reporters waited beyond the iron gates in the cold cameras, ready hoping for a single clean shot of a face worth printing. Inside, the light did what light does in houses like these. It made everything look effortless. Chandeliers threw soft fire across marble floors. Servers drifted between the guests, carrying trays of champagne that caught the glow and held it, so that every glass looked like liquid gold in someone's manicured hand. It was the kind of room where nothing was allowed to look like work, where the flowers had been flown in and the ice had been carved, and a kitchen full of people in black moved behind quiet doors, so the people in silk out front could believe abundance simply happened the way weather happens to those who deserve it. It was the birthday of the man who owned all of it. Julian Thorne, one of the wealthiest men in the country and one of the least comfortable being celebrated. He'd built his fortune out of nothing and turned it into something that touched half the industries in the nation, but he had never learned to enjoy a room that was looking at him. He would have preferred a quiet office and a long night of work to this. Everyone who knew him understood that. But his company had just closed the largest deal in its history, and his closest people had insisted gently, and then not so gently, that a man was allowed to mark a thing like that. So the house filled with businessmen and socialites and a few careful journalists, and the champagne moved and the music stayed low and expensive under the conversation. Beside him, in a gown that threw light every time she turned, stood the woman he was going to marry, Vanessa Sinclair. She came from old money, the kind whose name had been appearing in the society pages for 4 generations, long enough that people had stopped asking where it came from. Vanessa was beautiful, sharp, certain of herself in a way that filled a room before she'd said a word. And underneath all of it, there was something that never quite warmed. She measured people the way a jeweler measures stones, by what they were worth, what they wore, and how well they reflected on her. To Vanessa, tonight was not a celebration. It was a performance, and she intended to be its star, and she was good at it. That was the part people always underestimated. Earlier that evening, she had crossed the entire room to greet an older woman in silver, the widow whose quiet approval half this circle secretly orbited, and asked after the woman's granddaughter's piano recital. By name. She remembered it had been Chopin. She remembered the girl had been nervous. The widow had glowed for 10 straight minutes. So it was never that Vanessa couldn't be warm or couldn't hold a name in her head. She simply kept a ledger of who was worth the warmth. And the people in black vests carrying trays 3 feet from her all night had never once made the page. "I wanted everything tonight to feel curated," she told a ring of guests, tilting her champagne toward the long dessert table like a woman pointing out her own portrait. She said the word curated the way other people said expensive. Across the room, a server straightened a crooked row of glasses with 2 fingers and said nothing at all. She had made half of what was on that table with her own hands. She let the woman take the credit. Her name was Simone Aubrey, And she was 26 years old, though she carried herself like someone who'd been trusted with heavy things young. She was not a maid. She was not a fixture of this house. She was the catering captain, the one the company sent when a night could not be allowed to go wrong. You could see it in how she worked. She never rushed and she never froze. When a junior server drifted toward the wrong table, one small tilt of Simone's head turned him around. When a tray came back heavy, she took it without breaking her stride. She knew every name on her team and used all of them quietly, like a woman who understood that being seen and being respected were two different things. She belonged in this room the way a surgeon belongs in an operating theater, completely and only for as long as the work required. Vanessa did not see it that way. Twice already that evening, she had summoned a server with a snap of two fingers, the way you'd call a dog you didn't much like. Once, when a young man set a water glass a half-inch out of place, she had reached over and moved it herself with a small, pained smile, as if correcting the failures of lesser people were simply a burden she was born to carry. Simone watched from the edges, but not the woman at the center. Vanessa she had read in the first 5 minutes. It was the man she was studying, because Julian Thorne did the small things. When an older server reached to clear his end of the table, he stood and pulled the heavy chair aside so she wouldn't have to. He caught his assistant's eye across the room, said something that made the younger man laugh, and used his name. "Warren, tell the kitchen those short ribs were the best thing I've eaten all year." He meant it enough that the assistant actually went to tell them. Simone marked it. She was not admiring him. She was deciding something about him, and she wasn't finished yet. Two worlds stood in that one bright room. One had come through the front doors in cars worth more than houses. The other had come in through the kitchen an hour early in black vests and would leave the same way long after the last guest was gone. And the woman moving quietly between them, the one nobody at the party could have named, was the only person in the house carrying a secret old enough to end an engagement. Simone had not schemed her way into this house. That mattered later to the few who ever learned the whole story, that she hadn't manipulated a single thing to stand in that ballroom on that particular night. Her company had simply won the contract the way it won a dozen contracts a season. The assignment sheet had gone up in the staging kitchen 3 days earlier, printed and pinned to the corkboard like every other job. She'd read it standing with a coffee, half listening to two prep cooks argue about a sauce. And then she'd seen the name at the top of the page. Thorne. She had stood very still for a moment, coffee going cold in her hand, while 30 years she had never lived through moved quietly behind her eyes, because she knew that name. She had known it since she was a girl, not from the newspapers, though it was in the newspapers often enough. She knew it from her mother's kitchen, from long evenings when Odessa Aubrey would come home with her feet aching and her hands cracked from other people's dishes and tell her daughter stories to keep the exhaustion at bay. Most of those stories Simone had let float away the way children do. But one had stayed. One her mother told again and again in the last years when the telling seemed to matter more than the memory. A story about a family Odessa had worked for when she was young, a family that had nearly lost everything in a winter so cold and so poor that Odessa had done something she never fully explained and never once regretted. Her mother had never named that family to strangers, but she had named them to Simone, quietly, once, and made her remember. The last months came back to her in pieces. Her mother grown thin, spending her afternoons in a narrow bed by the window because the light there was kind. The particular quiet of a house where everyone is being brave. And one afternoon, near the end, Odessa had called her daughter close and pressed something into her hands. Not a new thing. The old recipe box that had lived on their kitchen shelf Simone's whole life, the one her mother had cooked from every single day, its cards soft and stained and filled edge to edge with a lifetime of careful handwriting. It was heavier than it looked, because behind the cards, folded into the very back of it, her mother had tucked something Simone had never seen. When the moment is right, her mother had said, her fingers trembling as they closed over Simone's, "You'll give this to a man named Julian Thorne, the whole box." A slow breath. "There's a letter in the back of it. Don't read it. It isn't yours, it's his. He has to be the one to open it." Simone had asked her when, what moment, how she would possibly know. Her mother had only smiled the small, tired smile of someone who has run out of everything but certainty. "You'll know it," she'd said. "I won't give you a day. A day isn't the same as the right time." And she'd closed her eyes, and that had been almost the last of it. So Simone had kept her word on both counts. For 9 years, she cooked from the front of that box her mother's recipes fed strangers at 100 parties like this one, and for 9 years she never once disturbed the folded thing in the back. She knew a letter was in there, and a photograph tucked beside it. Her mother had said that much. She did not know what a single word of either one said, and she had never used what little she carried to ask anyone for a thing. And now the name at the top of an assignment sheet had done what 9 years of searching never had. It had simply arrived. She could have traded the shift. Any captain could. She stood at that corkboard long enough to feel how much easier it would be to let the moment pass and stay a stranger, then took the box down from the top of her closet that same night and set it in her bag. Not because she was sure, because a promise 9 years old still weighs the same as the day it was made. But her mother had said, when the moment is right, and that left one thing for Simone to decide whether it was. So all evening between the trays and the small emergencies of a party this size, she watched the man the box was meant for, testing him against the story her mother had told, asking whether the boy in it had grown into a man who deserved the truth or one who would only be embarrassed by it. And somewhere between the soup course and the dessert, in a room full of people who would never have looked at her twice, Simone Aubrey got her answer. It was tonight. It had to be tonight. She just didn't yet know what it would cost her to get there. The dessert was Simone's, and it was the one part of the night she had asked to handle herself. Vanessa had ordered what she called a rustic heritage dessert course. She'd used the phrase to the event planner, twice delighted with it, the way she was delighted with any word that made money sound like taste. Somewhere in that order, unremarkable among a dozen sophisticated things, was a simple Southern buttermilk pie. Common enough to belong. Common enough that no one would look at it twice. Simone had made it from her mother's recipe, a card worn thin pulled from the front of that same box she'd carried in with her tonight. She had not planned it as a message. She'd made it because it was hers, and because on a night this heavy, she had wanted one honest thing in the room that was truly her own. She hadn't understood yet how much that small choice would come to mean. The plates went out. And for a while it was just a party, the low, satisfied hum of expensive people being fed exactly what they expected. "You have to try the pie," Vanessa announced to her cluster of guests, lifting her fork like a woman presenting a discovery. "I found the most wonderful little idea, something heritage, something with roots. It's absolutely divine." She said it as if she had baked it herself in a kitchen she had never once entered. A few of the guests murmured agreement, and the word divine traveled the table, the way her words always did, picked up, passed on, believed. At the head of the table, Julian took a bite, without really tasting it. He was still half-turned toward a conversation, still nodding at something a man in a gray suit was saying about markets. And then he stopped. He set his fork down slowly, and for one strange second, he was not a billionaire in his own ballroom. He was a boy at a cold kitchen table 30 winters gone, in a house that smelled of wood smoke and worry. A boy being handed a warm plate by a pair of hands he had somehow spent 3 decades forgetting. The taste was in his mouth, and it was wrong to be here. It belonged to a different life, a poorer one he had climbed so far and so fast out of that he'd half convinced himself it had happened to someone else. It was plain and a little sweet and honest, in a way nothing else on that gold-lit table was, and it undid him precisely because it was so simple. He turned his head, still holding the strange, sinking familiarity of it. "Warren," he said, and his voice had changed just enough that the assistant leaned in. Who made the dessert? Warren didn't know. The kitchen tonight was the catering company's. The names weren't his to have. He said he'd find out. Julian nodded and let it go, or told himself he had. He picked the fork back up. He made himself return to the conversation about markets. A taste was only a taste, he decided. A coincidence. Houses like this one flew in chefs from 4 countries. Of course, something on the table would happen to brush an old memory. But the feeling didn't leave. It sat under his ribs for the rest of the meal, like a name he couldn't quite recall, the specific ache of almost remembering someone. Across the room, a server in a black vest was clearing the far end of the table. She had watched him set the fork down. She had watched him go still and turn and ask Warren a question with a face he probably thought no one could read. Simone read it. She had spent 9 years learning to recognize the exact moment a person touches a ghost. When the plates were cleared and the last of the coffee was going out, she went to her bag in the staging area and took out the box. She held it for a moment in the cool of the back hallway, the worn corners, the soft weight of it, and let herself breathe once. Then she carried it out into the light. Not to the gift table. Not with any ceremony. She set it quietly near Julian Thorne's place, the way a caterer returns something that belongs to the host, and she said the only words she'd rehearsed. From the kitchen, she told Warren, who happened to be nearest. For Mr. Thorne, when there's a moment. Warren glanced at the plain little box, then at her calm, unhurried face, and simply nodded and set it aside to hand over later. He had no reason to think it was anything at all. Neither did anyone else in that room, which was exactly why what happened next landed the way it did. The gifts came out after the coffee, the way they always do at a party like this as theater. Someone rang a small silver bell. The music dipped. Guests drifted in from the terraces and the bar and gathered in a loose ring around the long table, where the presents had been building all night into a small hill of gold paper and silk ribbon. This was the part of the evening Vanessa loved most. Not the giving, the watching, the way every eye in the room turned to the same place, and she was standing in it. She had appointed herself mistress of the ceremony without anyone asking. She stood beside Julian, moving the boxes into a pleasing order, reading the cards aloud with little approving sounds, curating even this. And it was there, tidying the hill of expensive things, that her hand found something that did not belong. A small, worn box. No paper, no ribbon, no designer's name stamped anywhere on it. A thing that looked in that sea of gloss, exactly like what it was, something honest, that had wandered into a room built to punish honest things. She picked it up between 2 fingers and held it away from her body, and she let a small, amused smile find her mouth before she spoke, because she already knew this was going to be fun. And what, she said loud enough to Carrie, turning it over as if searching for the part that would explain itself, is this? A few heads turned. The nearest conversations died. Did someone from catering mistake the gift table for the lost and found? She lifted it higher, displaying it. It's a recipe box. Somebody's actually left a kitchen box on the gift table. A ripple of laughter went through the ring of guests, the nervous kind, the kind people let out before they've decided whether they're allowed to. From the edge of the room, Simone felt her chest tighten. She had not expected the box to be found like this, not held up like a stain, not turned into the night's entertainment before she'd had the chance to place it in the right hands at the right moment. But she did not move yet. She had learned long ago that the worst thing you can do in a room that has decided to laugh at you is to give it more to laugh at. Vanessa was enjoying herself now. She turned the box toward a nearby server. Whose is this? Which of you left it here? When no one answered quickly enough, her eyes swept the room's edges past the guests to the people in black vests standing along the walls and landed on the one woman who had not looked away. Was it you? The question was sharpened to a point and aimed to embarrass, not to learn. Simone stepped off the wall. She did not hurry and she did not shrink. Her hands folded in front of her spine straight, and she let herself have exactly one slow breath, the only crack she would allow the room to see. "That one's mine, ma'am," she said. Clear, even, not 1 degree of shame in it. And that steadiness did something Vanessa hadn't planned for. A woman who cried could be pitied and dismissed. A woman who stood there calm, unbothered, meeting her eye like an equal, that was harder. That was somehow worse. So Vanessa turned to Julian, softening her voice into something that sounded almost kind and cut twice as deep for it. "Darling, you don't actually want to open something the help made. Not in front of all these people." The word help landed in the quiet room softer than a slap. Somewhere near the back, someone laughed and then wished they hadn't. "I mean, honestly," Vanessa went on, warming to the audience, her free hand opening toward the ring of glittering guests as if presenting evidence. "I don't know why the staff feel they need to give gifts at all. It's a lovely gesture, I'm sure. But there's a place for that sort of thing. Perhaps understanding where the line is simply isn't part of the job." A few guests shifted. A woman in emerald studied her own shoes. A man cleared his throat and looked toward the bar. No one yet said the thing that would have ended it, that this was cruel and small, and beneath the room they all pretended to be. Simone said nothing. She held her ground, and she held her face, and she absorbed it, the whole warm weight of 100 strangers, deciding in real time whether she was a person or a punchline. And Vanessa, mistaking silence for surrender, went one step too far. She glanced toward Warren, standing near his employer, and pitched her voice to reach him. "In fact," she said lightly, "perhaps we should look at who we're trusting in this house. People who don't understand simple boundaries probably shouldn't be handling anything that matters." The meaning was plain to everyone in the room. She had just suggested in front of 100 witnesses that the woman be fired. Julian, who had been drawn a half step away by another guest, turned back into the strange stillness of it, a room that had been laughing a minute ago and was now holding its breath. He read it the way he read a negotiation gone wrong, the tension first, the source second. His fiancée flushed and pleased, holding a plain box like a verdict. A server against the wall, pale, perfectly composed, looking not at the floor, but straight ahead. And 100 wealthy people very carefully not meeting anyone's eyes. "What's going on here?" he asked. His voice was quiet, and it went to the corners of the room anyway. "Nothing important," Vanessa said quickly, waving it off. "Just a small lapse in judgment from one of the catering girls." She held the box out to him with 2 fingers, the way you'd hand someone a thing you'd rather not touch. "Here, this was apparently your gift, from her." She said the word her as if it cost her something to acknowledge that the woman had a pronoun at all. Julian took the box. He didn't open it right away. He looked at the woman against the wall first, and then at the box in his hands, and something in the plainness of it snagged on the strange feeling he'd been carrying since the dessert. The taste he couldn't name, the memory that wouldn't quite surface. It was worn at the corners, not new worn the way a prop is distressed to look old, used worn, handled, the particular softness a thing gets from 30 years of being taken down off a shelf and put back. He lifted the lid. On top, before anything else, before the folded letter beneath it, before the old photograph tucked along the side, there was a single index card, handwritten. The ink faded to the brown that ink fades to when it has waited a very long time to be read. And Julian Thorne went still in a way the whole room could see and none of them could understand. Because he knew the handwriting. He had seen it on paper bags packed with a school lunch he'd been ashamed of at the time and would have given anything to hold again. He had seen it on the label of a medicine bottle in a house where medicine had been a thing you chose instead of other things. He had seen it, though he had let himself forget it, in the worst and most important winter of his life. His eyes moved down the card to the 2 words at the top written in that same careful, patient hand. Buttermilk pie. The taste came back all at once, the dessert, the strange ache under his ribs, the boy at the cold table, the warm plate, the hands. It was not a coincidence. It had never been a coincidence. It was the same recipe. It was her recipe. and it had just been served to a room full of people who had spent the last 5 minutes laughing at the woman who'd made it. The color left his face. The guests saw it happen and did not know what they were seeing. They had gathered for a small, cruel comedy, The Billionaire, opening the maid's silly little box, and instead they were watching a man's whole face change over an index card, and none of them could read why. Which is exactly why no one moved. No one laughed. The room simply waited the way a room waits when it senses without understanding that the ground has shifted under it. Julian's thumb had stopped on the card. When he finally spoke, it was not to his fiancée. It was not to the room. "Where did you get this?" He was looking at the woman by the wall, and this time, unlike at the dessert, when he'd made himself turn away and call it nothing, he did not look away. Simone met his eyes. Whatever she saw in them, it was not the thing she had feared for 9 years. It was not embarrassment. It was not the face of a man being handed an inconvenience from a past he'd rather forget. It was recognition. He was already halfway to the truth, and the box wasn't even fully open. "It was my mother's," she said quietly. Just that. She let it sit. And here was the thing only Simone knew she didn't know either. She had carried that box for 9 years and kept her promise never to open the back of it. Whatever her mother had trusted to a stranger's hands instead of her own daughter's, she was about to hear it for the first time against a wall along with everyone else in the room. And Julian Thorne, standing in the middle of his own birthday, surrounded by everyone who had come to admire everything he'd built, opened the letter that was going to tell them both what all of it had been built on. Beneath the card lay a letter folded soft from years of handling in that same patient hand. Behind it, he could see the edge of a photograph, and behind that, something smaller, a slip of paper he couldn't make out yet. He didn't read the letter first. He looked up instead, at the dessert plates still scattered down the long table, then at the woman who had called the pie divine, then at the whole glittering ring of guests who had laughed. "This," he said, lifting the recipe card until the light caught the faded ink, "is the pie my fiancé told you all was divine. An hour ago." His voice was steady in the way a voice is steady when the man behind it is not. "And she's right. It's the best thing on this table." He let it land. "It was also made by the woman you spent the last 5 minutes laughing at." The word divine seemed to hang in the air over Vanessa's head, and there was no reaching up to take it back. A murmur started somewhere in the crowd and thought better of itself. Then he read the letter, some aloud, some in his own words. He gave it to them in short, plain pieces, and the room took each one like a step down into cold water. 30 years ago, there had been a winter that nearly ended his family. His father sick, the small business failing, the medicine costing more than they had, a boy himself 1 hard month away from leaving school to find work. Somewhere in the crowd, a glass was set down and not picked back up. "There was a woman who worked for us that winter," Julian said. "Only a little while, long before we were worth working for." His eyes found Simone and stayed there. Her name was Odessa Aubrey, and she spent everything she had keeping us alive, the medicine, the food, all of it cooked right out of this same box. She fed a dying man and a terrified boy back from the edge. His jaw worked once before the rest came. And she never let us see what it cost her. She wanted us to survive it and forget her. God help me, we did. No one was chuckling now. He drew out the photograph next. He didn't hold it up for the room this time. He only looked at it, a thin, tired man outside a small house, a boy at his side who was unmistakably Julian. Before any of this, and half a step behind them, both barely in the frame, a young woman no one glancing at the picture would ever have noticed. Exactly the way her daughter had stood all night against the wall of this very room. Then his thumb found the last thing in the box, the small slip he hadn't been able to make out. He read it, and his hand went unsteady. An IOU. His father's handwriting, 30 years old. A promise to repay a sum they'd had no way on earth to repay, signed Harold Thorne. My father couldn't take charity, Julian said quietly. It would have broken him. So he made her let him sign for it, made it a debt so it wouldn't have to be a gift. He turned the slip over in his fingers. The back was blank, uncashed, uncollected. 30 years, she never came for a single cent of it. And then there were a few more lines at the very bottom of the letter, the last words Odessa had written meant for the man in the photograph, and no one else. Julian's eyes moved across them slow. Whatever they said, they took something out of him that all the rest of it hadn't. He pressed his lips together, folded the letter shut along its soft creases, and did not read them aloud. Some things his face said were not for this room. The silence in the room had changed its nature entirely. It was no longer the silence of people waiting for a joke to land. It was the silence of 100 wealthy strangers realizing all at once that they had spent 5 minutes laughing at the single most dignified person in the house. Julian turned fully toward the woman against the wall now, and he seemed to forget the rest of them. "Why did you wait?" he asked. His voice was low, but the room was so quiet, it carried anyway. "You've worked 3 feet from me all night. You could have said something at the door. Why did you wait so long?" Simone wiped once at the corner of her eye, and it was the only time all night she let anyone see her do it. When she answered, her voice was steady, and it had that same quiet grip it had held from the first word. "It wasn't a card I could hand you at the door," she said. She let a breath out. "My mother told me to wait until it would mean something, not just to me, to you." She looked at him level, unafraid. "She said I'd know the moment when it came. She was right. It's tonight." Julian looked down at the letter and the card and the photograph and the paper his father had signed in the worst winter of both their lives. And then he looked up at the woman who had held all of it for 9 years and never once used it to ask him for a thing. For a moment he just stood there, the box in his hands, 30 years closing the distance between the boy at the cold table and the man in the bright room. Then he turned to face the guests, the whole glittering ring of them, the ones who had laughed and the ones who had only watched and let it happen. "Tonight, I found out who actually stood by my family," he said, "when standing by us cost something and bought nothing." He held up the little worn card. Her mother did, a woman most of the people in that world never bothered to see. And I found out something else. His eyes moved across the room unhurried, and the room could not hold them. I found out how quickly a group of people will decide who's worth their respect, based on a vest, based on a plain box, based on nothing real at all. A woman in emerald was crying quietly and trying not to show it. A man near the bar set his drink down as if it had become distasteful. No one defended themselves because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. And then Julian turned to Vanessa. She had gone pale by degrees over the last several minutes, and now she stood clutching her champagne like a railing. She opened her mouth. For the first time all evening, nothing clever came out. "You spent this whole night," Julian said to her, and he did not raise his voice because he did not need to, deciding who in this room was worth your attention. He looked down at the ring box that had been sitting near the front of the pile all along, the one she had no doubt arranged there at the very center where she'd meant the night to end. He did not open it. He set it aside gently on the table. "You just told me everything I needed to know," he said. The words were quiet, and they were absolute, and everyone in the room understood exactly what had just happened, though he never said the word over. Vanessa did not crumple. That was almost the worst of it. Something crossed her face, fury first, then the cold arithmetic of a woman already deciding how she'd tell this story later to people who hadn't been in the room. Then she gathered herself the way she gathered herself before every entrance. Chin up, composure re-armored. "You want to know the difference between me and everyone in this beautiful room?" she said, and she was almost smiling. "An hour ago, every one of them laughed with me." Her eyes moved over the guests who now could not meet them. "I'm just the only one in it who won't stand here and pretend I've had a change of heart the moment it got expensive not to." And that was the terrible thing about it. A thread of it was true, and everyone in the room knew it was true, and for a long second, no one could look at anyone else. So spare me the sermon. She set her glass down with enormous care. I do hope you'll all be very happy. She turned for the door with her spine straight, and for one step, then two, it almost worked. She almost left the way she had always arrived untouchable. And then she passed the older woman in silver, the widow whose granddaughter played Chopin, the one whose quiet approval this entire circle had orbited for as long as any of them could remember. Vanessa slowed half a second, the old reflex of a woman expecting to be received. The widow looked at her for a long moment, and then without hurry she turned her back and lifted her glass toward the woman in the black vest instead. It was the smallest gesture in the room, and it was the loudest thing that happened all night. It was also the only answer anyone gave to what Vanessa had just said. Not an argument, not a defense, only a room quietly choosing the woman in the vest over the woman in the gown. Vanessa understood it the way only someone fluent in that language ever could. The engagement was the least of what she had just lost. The circle she had performed for all evening had without a single word closed its doors, and she felt them close behind her. She was not being thrown out of a marriage. She was being quietly written out of a world. She walked faster after that. No one watched her go. They had already turned toward the wall, toward the woman they had spent an entire evening overlooking, and the whole center of gravity in that bright gold-lit room had moved with them. The rest of the evening reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. One by one, the guests who had laughed came to the woman by the wall. Some managed apologies. Some only managed a few clumsy, quiet words. A few couldn't meet her eyes and said them to the floor. Simone received all of it with the same even grace she'd shown when the room was cruel because dignity. It turned out looked exactly the same whether the room was laughing at you or ashamed of itself. And Julian Thorne did something a man in his position was not required to do. In front of everyone still standing there, he pulled out the chair beside his own, the same gesture he'd made all night for the servers. Everyone else ignored, and he asked Simone to sit, not to serve, to sit, beside him, for what was left of his birthday. It was a small thing. It was the whole thing. 100 people watched a billionaire clear a place at his own table for a woman they had spent the evening deciding didn't have one, and no one in that room would ever forget the shape of it. The party thinned out quietly after that. The gold paper and silk ribbon stayed unopened on the table, and the plainest object in the house, a worn little recipe box that had been held up as a joke, sat open beside the birthday man's plate worth more than everything wrapped in gold combined. The story of that night traveled the way stories do in certain circles, quietly in pieces, never quite confirmed. Within a few weeks, people knew the engagement was off, though almost no one who hadn't been there ever learned exactly why. Those who had been there understood completely, and most of them had the grace to be a little different afterward. Julian tried once to do the obvious thing. A week later, he offered quietly, carefully, to make sure Simone never had to work another night she hadn't chosen. He was a man who solved things with a checkbook, and he reached for it the way he always had. She turned it down, gently and without a flicker of doubt. "My mother didn't do what she did to be paid back," she told him. "If I take your money now, I make her a debt. She spent 30 years making sure she never became one." She held his eyes. "I don't want to be paid for who she was. I just wanted you to know her." So he found the only thing she would accept something shaped like the story instead of like a settlement. He built a scholarship and put her mother's name on it. The Odessa Aubrey Fund for children from the kind of winter the Thornes had once barely survived, so that when a family had to choose between medicine and a child's future, the child could stay in school anyway. The way a boy named Julian once had, because a woman nobody noticed had decided to make sure of it. Odessa had spent everything so one boy could keep his seat in a classroom. 30 years on, that boy made certain her name would keep other children in theirs. It was the only repayment that didn't insult the gift. And there was one last thing he did, and it was the smallest, and it mattered most. Before Simone left the estate that night, he pressed the letter back into her hands. "These were written to me," he said, his voice gone rough. "But they're hers, and she's yours." So it was that Simone, alone under a lamp in a quiet room, finally read the words her mother had trusted to a stranger before she'd ever trusted them to her own daughter. The last lines were not about the winter, not the medicine, not the money her father had signed for and never paid. "If he ever tries to pay you back," her mother had written in the same careful hand that had labeled 30 years of recipe cards, "don't you let him. Tell him the pie was always free." That was the whole point of it, that some things are given and ask nothing back, and the giving is the entire reward. He was a hungry boy once, and I fed him, and I would do it again for nothing at all. Let him keep that. It is worth more than his money ever could be. And beneath that one line, more a small thing, almost an afterthought. It was the reason Simone, folding the letter, looked again at the old photograph. Really looked the way you look at something you've passed 100 times and never once seen. Her mother barely more than a girl, half a step behind the thin man and the tired boy. And they're small, easy to miss, wrapped against the cold of a house she was keeping warm for another family, a bundle held against her chest. A baby, a few months old. Simone knew whose it was. She sat with it a while under the lamp in the quiet. The knowledge that she had been inside that house too, that winter, carried from room to room, while her mother cooked a stranger's family back from the edge. She never mentioned it to Julian. Some things you don't hand to anyone. Some things you simply carry the way her mother had. Wealth can dress a person in confidence. It can fill a room, command a table, turn a plain and honest thing into a punchline for the length of an evening. But it could never have bought what sat inside that worn little box, a kindness handed down one generation, carried 9 years, and set down at exactly the right moment. The pie was always free. That was the whole point. The richest man in the country spent 30 years learning what a poor woman with a baby on her hip had always known, that the things worth the most are the ones we give asking nothing back. In the coldest winters, when we're certain no one important is watching. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment hit hardest, the taste he couldn't name, the letter he refused to read aloud, or the baby in the photograph that nobody noticed for 30 years. And if you believe quiet dignity should outweigh loud money, that the people we overlook are often the ones carrying the deepest truths. Take a second to like this video and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. So stay close. The next one might just change the way you see the room you're standing in.